Hello and welcome to the Chiropractic YouTube channel. I'm here today with my lovely assistant Mary Lou, and she's going to be helping me differentiate between a hip flexor strain or hip flexor issue and a hip impingement. A hip impingement often will be confused for a groin strain or a hip flexor issue because it will refer to this front hip area or kind of the central groin area as well. The pain is commonly in those two areas. Sometimes it's from this front hip all the way into the groin. And a lot of times it just feels like a really tight hip. And often all the stretches that you've done in the world don't fix it. So here's some tests to give you an idea of which one we're dealing with. So we're going to start with doing a hip flexor strength test. So we're going to have Mary Lou go ahead and lift her leg up. We're actually going to go straight because it's going to be a psoas test. And we're going to go out this way. And she's just going to go ahead and push up against my hand. And I'm going to try to push her down. Okay. I'm going to reach down and stabilize Mary Lou's other hip. She's going to go ahead and push her ankle into my hand here. And I'm going to try to push her away. She's going to bring her leg across here. And if that does cause pain, then it's likely that you have a psoas issue. If it doesn't cause you any pain, then it's probably not a psoas or hip flexor issue. The other thing that could possibly also cause pain is a low back disc, because sometimes as you're trying to recruit the necessary strength to do that, you start to bend here, and that can also be a disc issue, but that's another topic. So we're also going to go ahead and test it this way and have her go ahead and resist me as I push her down. Any pain with that at all? Okay. That is another general hip flexor test, but that is also something that could potentially hurt a hip impingement as well. So that one could kind of go either way. But usually the general idea with this is if your hip hurts with your knee bent, it's more likely to be hip impingement. And if it doesn't, if it hurts more with the leg straight, it's more likely to be hip flexor. So for instance, we're going to go into one more hip flexor test. This time, we're going to have Mary Lou grab her knee here. And the hip flexor that we're interested in is this side. And see how this leg kind of starts to come up off the table? Not very high in her case because she doesn't really have an issue. But for instance, if she had a really bad hip flexor or a really tight one, this would start to kind of migrate off the ground because this muscle in front is so short that her leg starts to come up as she moves the other side. And if she were to have a psoas issue, she would likely have some shortening and some migration of the leg upward with that. Now, we're going to get into the hip impingement test. Like I said, the big differentiator between a hip impingement or a hip flexor is with hip flexors, you will have pain when you lift the leg straight. And with hip impingement, it's more of a bent knee position or bent knee with rotation this way or this way. So what that looks like when we lift up her knee is we're going to lift it up all the way. We're going to kind of crank her knee inward. So we're kind of rotating her hip inward like this. And if that hurts, that's more likely to be a hip impingement. Similarly, this test can also cause some pain for a hip impingement, but more of a different type of hip impingement. So we're going to stabilize the hip, kind of open her into a figure 4 and then press down. If that hurts, there's more likely something to be wrong with the hip joint itself. So that's not just for hip impingements, that can be for other hip joint issues, but the big deal is if that hurts you or it's an uncomfortable stretching sensation, it's not your hip flexor. Similarly, if your knee is bent and just going into this high level of flexion, or if you lift it up and you're going into high level of flexion here, it's probably not your hip flexor quite as much. So the other thing too here is that obviously there's that straight leg bent knee thing that you're trying to rule out here. And sometimes, you know what, you'll still have some hip flexor pain even with a bent knee as you go up. But the idea is if you start at the bottom here, bend your knee and it doesn't hurt, and then as slowly you start to go a little higher with your hip and it hurts right at the end, that means that it's more of a joint issue because the joint is kind of impacting. That ball and socket's kind of coming together and it's bothering the hip in some way. So if it's a hip flexor, it'll hurt from the beginning of the range of motion. So if it's hip flexor and she starts to lift her leg up like this, go ahead and lift your leg up for me, kind of just bring your knee to your chest. If that hurts, then that's more likely to be a hip flexor if it hurts from the beginning. If it hurts just at the end here, when she pulls it in there and it hurts just right there, then that's more likely to be a hip impingement because it's just when the joint gets to the end of its range of motion. So this is important because the treatment that we would do for either of those is very different, and both of them are pretty easily treatable. That's a video for another time, and if you'd like to ask me any questions on this, you can just go ahead and email the email below in the description or leave a comment or subscribe. My website is www.chiropractic.com, so you can head over there too if you would like to reach out or ask any questions. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.